Our next speaker is Dr. Dambisa Moyo. She's an international economist and the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Dead Aid, How the West Was Lost, and Winner Take All. She travels around the world. I think she's been to 50 countries, and she studies the economies there, and she's going to tell us what she's learned. Dambisa.
I'm just going to change it up a little bit, and I'm going to actually sit down, if that's okay with you. So good afternoon. I'm here to tell you a very scary story about what I see is the biggest risk and the biggest challenge that will be affecting our society and our way of life over the next 10 years. And this is the story of resource scarcity. Importantly, I'm going to be talking to you about one of the great crusaders right now, which is China, and how it is that China has separated herself from the rest of us in devising a very systematic and deliberate campaign to secure natural resources for herself. In order to do this effectively, though, I think it's really important for me to first set the story in a global context. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk a little bit about the demand pressures that are emanating around the world for natural resources. And then I'll talk to you about the supply constraints of arable land, water, energy, and minerals. I'll spend a few minutes talking to you specifically about what China is doing and how, in a very deliberate and systematic way, she's going around the world and securing natural resources for her economic growth and prosperity. I'll then conclude by giving you some very live, real-life examples of what China has been doing over the last several years, and certainly since 2004, when China began in earnest this campaign of going out into the international community. Let me start by saying 2 things that are particularly important in regards to commodities. First of all, since 2009, so in the aftermath of the financial crisis, commodity prices have increased over 150%, so just in 3 years. Whether it's because of the drought that the United States is suffering this year, or because of export bans that we've seen in places like Russia and around the world, the fact of the matter is that there have been significant price increases in many of the commodities that we'll be discussing this afternoon. I might add that the IMF and other international agencies are forecasting that commodity prices will continue to rise over the next decade. In fact, both the EIA, which is the Energy Information Association, and the IMF expect that oil prices will be around $200 in the close of this decade. The second thing that I think is really important to bear in mind is that as we sit here in Houston today, there are at least 25 wars and conflicts around the world that have their origins in commodity scarcity. I won't go through all of them, and many of them you may be familiar with, but already as we sit here today, and perhaps even ignore, the fact of the matter is that there are many conflicts and many people already suffering the consequences of resource scarcity. But in order to put this picture into play, let me start by talking to you specifically about the 3 key demand drivers that are creating this incredible pressure for resources around the world. The first thing is just the population of the world. Today, we stand at around 7 billion people. The expectation is that by 2050, there'll be about 9 billion people on the planet. And only at 2100 will the population of the world plateau off to around 10 billion people, according to statistics from the United Nations. Why is this important? Well, it's important because if you speak to demographers, we are actually living in a very unique time in the history of the world. A time in which the population has skyrocketed from around 3 billion people in 1960 to 7 billion where we are today. But more importantly, most demographers believe that this is a period that we have not seen in history or prehistory, and once we pass 2100, we will never see a rapid growth in the human species ever again. So it is a very unique time in our lives. I might also add that in places like India, the population is growing at 1 million people per month, and the international world population is growing by around 80 million people per year, which is basically equivalent of adding a new Germany every year. The second key driver of demand of commodities is wealth increases. 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets, and this is something that people tend to forget. And as it is right now, many of the leading forecasters, economists and consulting firms believe that there will be 3 billion new people in the world's middle class by 2020, so just a few years away. Many of them in the emerging world, predominantly, and many of them looking to see improvements in not just what they drive, the ability to have televisions, to have cars, but also indoor plumbing and better quality foods. And all of this is a massive draw on resources. It's worth saying that in terms of population growth, this year and next year, the IMF forecasts that the regions of China, India, and Africa will be the fastest growing regions, each of them growing over 6% a year. The third key driver of demand for commodities is urbanization. Today, there are about 3 billion people that live in urban areas. The expectation by most economists is that there'll be 5 billion people, the majority of the world's population, living in urban areas by, again, 2020, so just around the corner. Today, in the United States, there are about 9 cities that have 1 million people or more. In Europe, there are 18 cities that have 1 million people or more. In China today, there are approximately 100 cities with 1 million people or more. If you travel around the emerging world, as I've had the good fortune to do, I've been to over 50 countries, and the urbanization policy is a very key and deliberate policy set up by governments. Today, the Chinese government has a policy in place to ensure that by 2020, they will have 221 cities with 1 million people or more. At that time, they also anticipate that they will have 10 million people in 8 cities, 10 million people each in 8 cities. This, to me, is mind-boggling because I come from a country, Zambia, Southern Africa, which has got a population of 10 million. So just spare thought for a minute of all the amount of resources that are required to provide infrastructure, indoor plumbing, telephones, connections, electricity, and so on to that sort of a population in such an urbanized region. It's worth pointing out that today China has more miles of road network than the United States, and they are deliberately pursuing a policy of continuing to provide infrastructure and indoor plumbing, but also built-out infrastructure in their cities so that they can meet the demands of their population. Now that I've given you the demand picture, I'd like to give you a quick snapshot of what's happening on the supply side. First of all, in terms of arable land, which is the land that we can actually till to grow food, the population in the world right now is living on 11% of arable land. That's the total amount of arable land that's available to us. Africa has the most untilled arable land left on the planet, and China, with 1.3 billion people, has only 7% arable land. If you turn to water, although 70% of the earth is water, less than 1% is actually available to us to use, even to clean our toilets. The next time you decide to go to McDonald's and order a quarter pounder, you might want to think that in order to produce 1 pound of steak, it requires 12,000 gallons of water. 12,000 gallons of water. But more than that, the amount of water required to produce a unit of electricity is much more from the production of biofuels than from traditional forms of energy. If you turn to energy, we are consuming 85 million barrels of oil every single day. The United States consumes by far the most amount. 20% of the consumption is from the United States. And China, with multiples the size of the United States population, is only at 10% of the world's consumption of oil. Think for a minute what the consequences of China's moving to, the average Chinese person moving to the consumption levels of the United States. It might be worth pointing out right now that we are today living off of the energy discoveries that were made back in the 1950s and 1960s. Put another way, although there are significant discoveries that are announced every now and then, the vast majority of discoveries have already been made. One of my favorite examples here is about a discovery that was made in offshore Brazil, a place called Tupi. A few years ago, the government made a massive announcement that they had discovered 123 billion barrels of oil. The markets reacted by selling off, and the price came down. And a few months later, the government came back and said, actually, although we do estimate that we have that amount of oil, it's sitting beneath 2 miles of salt. And actually, with the technologies that we have today, we may actually not be able to access it. So energy is a big deal. And we can obviously talk about shale, but that is a separate issue. And I think in large part, it may not offer the reprieve that many people think it will today. The last thing is really about copper and other minerals. China is actually really only short copper. Most other minerals she actually has. And as you may be aware, she's actually imposed significant export bans on things like rare earths, which are key inputs into mobile phones and televisions and so on. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting and worth thinking about is a study that the US Geological Society put out in 2005. The US Geological Society basically calculated the amount of mineral and metals contained in mobile phones that were lost in the United States only in 2004. That's 1 year, 2004, one country, the United States, and only lost and misplaced phones. And the estimate they came up with was that the metals contained there were equivalent to 50 747 jumbo jets. Now that I've suitably depressed you, I'd like to spend a bit of time telling you about what China is doing against this backdrop of significant demand and scarce, finite, and depleting supply. China has adopted a very aggressive approach that is pinned down by 3 key aspects. The first aspect is the idea of symbiosis. And this is the idea that China is going around to what I like to call the axis of the unloved, regions and countries around the world that have traditionally been ignored as destinations for investment by Western countries such as the United States. These are countries in places such as Africa, South America, Eastern Europe, and so on. As I promised you later, I will give you some examples of specifically what they're doing. It's worth remembering here that although every now and then I read in Western press that people are being enslaved or to neocolonialism, those statements are broadly absurd and ignored in the emerging markets. Why? Because 70% and sometimes higher of the populations in these regions are under the age of 24. In places like Uganda in East Africa, 50% of the population is under the age of 15. People need jobs, they need investment, and they need trade, and they need it quickly. Otherwise, there's a big risk that we'll end up with the situation that we're seeing right now in the Middle East and North Africa, which to me have very little to do with democracy and much more to do with the fact that people are frustrated that their living standards are not improving. So China is a fantastic partner. She comes in, she invests, she creates trade relationships, and she's able to provide job creation for many people around the world. There is a fantastic survey that was done by the Pew Institute, a research institute here in the United States. They went to 10 countries in Africa, and they asked the Africans, what do you think of the Chinese? Do you like them? Do you hate them? Are they better or worse than the Americans? Significant margins, 98%, 97% of the population said, we love the Chinese, they're transforming our lives, they're investing, creating jobs, and actually, I'm afraid to say, we prefer them to the Americans. The second key pillar of China's campaign has to do with the fact that she's got deep pockets. Of course, sitting here in the United States, you'll be very familiar with this because China is the largest lender to the United States government today. The estimates are that China, since 2004, has spent about $1 billion a week on investments in commodity-related investments around the world. Some people have actually gone around, and particularly in Wall Street, and claimed that China's overpaying for assets. So a copper mine that should be estimated to be at about $100 million, China is willing to pay, say, $500 million. Some people have scoffed and accused the Chinese of being a bit slow, not very clever, not able to estimate the true value of an asset. I actually spend a lot of time in China, and it's quite the contrary. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese government understands that in its political imperative, it needs to deliver economic growth, and it needs those resources to do it. And the way in which that she can secure those resources is by overpaying, what we would call overpaying, but actually making sure that she can actually get these resources. The fact that China has over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves today means that she will continue to pursue very aggressively this strategy. The final pillar of the Chinese campaign has to do with her becoming a monopsonist. The economists in the room will know that a monopsonist is the opposite of a monopolist. A monopsonist is the key buyer of a different resource or a different goods or service. So for example, think about Walmart in a place like Iowa, for example. If the farmers there are producing potatoes or tomatoes, then Walmart is the sole buyer and the main buyer and is able, therefore, to set the price of what they will pay for a certain commodity. Well, China has become already today the monopsonist for copper and coal, if you speak to many of the traders who trade these commodities. And it's with these three things that China has become incredibly aggressive and very much ahead in terms of this stance and campaign for resources. Let me give you a few examples of what she's done. In 2007, China bought a mountain in Peru, Mount Toromocho. Mount Toromocho is half the height of Mount Everest, and it contains about 2 billion tons of copper. China spent $3 billion. And just before I came out here, I was looking at where copper is trading today, and the estimate of the value of that copper contained in that mountain is now at around $16 trillion. How's that for a trade? India. China is rerouting the river Brahmaputra, and this has caused a lot of skirmishes, but water is a very serious problem in China. In parallel to rerouting whole rivers, China is also focusing very heavily on desalination, and today, China, followed by Saudi Arabia, are the leading countries focusing on R&D around desalination. In Brazil, just next door here to the United States, Brazil has China as its largest trading partner and largest also recipient of foreign direct investment, similar to places like Colombia and Chile also. If you turn to Canada, your neighbor to the north, we are now in the middle, just waiting to hear the final conclusion of the largest transaction that China's embarked upon in resource space, a $15.1 billion transaction to acquire Nexen. But that's just one example. Earlier this year, China engaged in a laptops for pork trade with Canada, where China was going to supply laptops and Canada was going to provide China with pork. My personal favorite, as I'm from Africa, is what China has done on my continent. The distance from the southmost point, Cape Town, to the northmost point of Africa, Cairo, is basically what famously Cecil Rhodes called Cape to Cairo, and he really hopes to build a road there. It's basically 3 times the distance of New York to California, about 9,000 miles. You can now drive on a road, tarred road, that full distance. It will take you about 5 weeks and through 15 countries, and you'll never get off the tar. And as you go through one country to the next country, there are massive signs as a generous gift from the People's Republic of China to the people of Africa. I'm going to leave you with the following thought. As you enter your election period here in another few days, couple weeks, please remember that there's a bigger election that we in the rest of the world, the 90% who live in the emerging world, are actually looking at. And our election is the competition between the United States, the largest economy in the world today, $15 trillion in GDP terms, which has democracy as its political ethos and has private capitalism as its economic stance. The challenger is China, second largest economy in the world with $7.5 trillion in GDP. It has no democracy as its political stance, and it has state capitalism as its economic approach. These two countries have identical Gini coefficients. Gini coefficients is our measure of income inequality. If you are sitting in Africa, in South America, in Eastern Europe, across the world, and you're watching this competition, you have to ask yourself, which should I vote for? Should I vote for the United States, which has a promise of democracy, which has a promise of private capitalism, but unfortunately has failed to deliver the promise of removing many people out of poverty? Or should I pick China, which has, over the last 3 decades, moved over 300 million people out of poverty, never been done before, and continues to grapple with moving an extra billion out of poverty also? This is the question that we face in our world. And this is the answer, because China right now is going around the world and very aggressively pitching her story. The problem is that the United States is not. The United States administration has preferred to scaremonger and is going around and creating an us versus them stance. We all want to live in democracy. We all want freedom. But in order to have democracy and freedom, we have to first have a middle class on the ground in our societies that's able to hold our governments accountable. And for that, China offers a better promise. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dambisa. I have a question for you. Your first book was an attack on aid to Africa, and your second book was about the death of American supremacy in the world based on greed and laziness. How did you decide to move into the issue of commodity scarcity?
So basically, it's as I mentioned, I'm from Africa. I've been raised in Africa, and I was quite astonished about the schism between what was actually happening when I was going to Africa and hearing people speaking so euphorically about what China was doing, how their lives are being transformed, and then reading Western press being so critical, talking about slave labor, talking about neocolonialism, and they had no evidence that this was actually the case. And in a time of mobile-ready, camera-ready mobile phones, you would have thought we'd have thousands of pictures of people being subjugated in these places. But there was no evidence, and I sought really to go around the world and really ask the question, is China sort of a bad egg? Is China doing things that people don't appreciate? And actually, unanimously, wherever I went, Russia and Kazakhstan, Brazil and Colombia, across Africa, even to places like Australia, which is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment from China, the answer was consistently that China was doing amazing things to transform people's livelihoods.
So usually when Americans think about what's going on in China, the Americans view it with trepidation or fear, or criticism of some sort. But you would change the way we talk about that. What would be the 3 words that we should use when we think about China's growth?
Well, I think first of all, it's really essential that people remember that China is a poor country. It is the second largest economy in GDP terms, but it's number 100 on a per capita income basis. And in fact, it's poorer than many African countries. We should spare a thought for China. What they are trying to do is insane. As I mentioned, I come from a country with 10 million people. We have failed over 50 years to deliver economic growth on a sustainable basis and put a dent in poverty. And yet we're asking China to do that for a population of 1 billion people. What we need in the world, not just for China, but for the world as a whole, is for the United States to become a partner, both in trade and foreign direct investment, a compassionate partner for making sure we can solve the ills of the world today. And we do not need the United States to scaremonger and to create a further schism with the us versus them that unfortunately has tended to mark the politics of this country today.
Thank you so much for your wisdom.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much.